evening, everyone. Thanks for coming to my lecture recital today. As some of you already know, so the final project for my degree program here at Peabody is a two-part research project. The first part is an academic paper, and the other part is this lecture recital, which is further divided into two portions. I will first give a presentation about my research. Afterwards, I will perform the work. And apparently my presentation is just a highly simplified version of my research. So in case if any of you are interested in the topic or my work, please feel free to contact me afterwards so I can get you a copy of the paper. Now, before we get into more details, let's examine the title real quick. It says Forging a Hybrid Identity. How does the musical work relate to someone's identity? Well, the premise here is that we see musical works as a sort of venue for self-expression, right? In other words, it kind of tells us who the composer is, as well as who they wish to become. So therefore, when we look at a musical cocktail, like 8 Memories in Watercolor here, we are not only seeing it as a hybrid of musical elements, which it is, but also a sort of confession from the composer about his hybrid, let's say, artistic selfhood. Okay, and therefore, for the rest of the presentation, my plan is that I first start with some backgrounds of the composer, with a focus on the historical environment when he grew up back the days in China, and up to the point when he composed this work actually as a college student. From there, I will delve into the work itself, talking about all the hybrid of musical elements, and eventually I will map this hybridity of musical elements onto the hybrid identity we started here. So Tan Dun, he's a Chinese-American composer. He was born in 1957 in the suburb of Changsha, which is the capital city of Hunan province, located around the central area, a little bit towards the southern area of the country. Now, he was among the generation who went through extraordinary economic hardship and political turmoil, which includes, for example, the Great Leap Forward, a political campaign that aimed for rapid industrialization and agricultural growth. The project, however, was unsuccessful and unfortunately led to excessive famine across the country. And because of the failure of the project, Mao Zedong lost much of his power within the Communist Party. And to sort of regain his power, Mao started this infamous Cultural Revolution with a stated goal to sort of eliminating capitalist remnants as well as old customs. And during the Cultural Revolution, music was strictly censored and musical performances was limited, with exceptions of course, propaganda music, such as revolution songs and modern operas. Now, these revolution songs are this kind of highly simplified vocal works that aims for mass gathering. For example, in the morning first class, the students will all stand up and sing the East is Red, right? And these modern operas are this kind of blend of Peking opera and Western symphony style. And contrary to many people's belief today, these modern operas were actually made with very high artistic standards. And Tan Dun's in his generation, in general, were highly fond of these modern operas, and they still talk about them today at gatherings. And after graduation from high school, Tan Dun was sent to a rural commune to work as a rice planter. And this was due to the Down to the Countryside movement, which called for the re-education of intellectual youth who were mainly high school graduates. My understanding of this movement was that because there were so few jobs back then in the country, so they sort of tried to send people out of the cityhood so that they don't make trouble there, right? And after a period of time, he joined this Hunan Peking opera troupe as a violinist. Now, there's very little account on how Tan Dun learned to play the violin. But if you think about that time, during the Cultural Revolution, if you're a middle or high school student, if you are not actively participating in the political activities on the street, you'll probably just spend a lot of time playing. You don't have to go to school that very often, right? And a lot of people just spend this time, let's say, playing in the nature, climbing trees, swimming in the river, make music with rocks, or let's say teach yourself to play the violin, right? And And joining a professional band like this was actually a very popular choice among these musically gifted youths at the time. And as a way to sort of not only gain professional experience, but also to sort of get rid of your term that you have to spend in the countryside. And after Mao died in 1976, the college system was set to reopen. And Tan Dun was among this first class to be accepted into the Beijing Central Conservatory. And this was in 1978, and he was part of the so-called class of 78, who were technically the first batch of college students after, let's say, 1950. And of course, this group of people, they are highly privileged. They have all the good jobs and resources of the country, and therefore included many successful composers and instrumentalists today. And it was also during this time when the country started going through a series of economic reform called the Reform and Opening Up, which collaterally encouraged individualism as well as cultural westernization. After he got his master's from the Central Conservatory, he moved to the States to further his study as a doctoral student at Columbia University, and this was in 1986. And of course, afterwards he stayed here and had a highly successful professional career. As a composer, Tan Dun not only receives frequent commissions from major symphony orchestras and opera houses, but also from film studios. His best known work apparently is the Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon for the film in early 2000. And he also works closely with the Chinese government, composing for many of the government-run events. His style, in general, I would say is a mixture of things. It's a confluence of mutually challenging, sometimes opposing musical elements. I have two examples for you here. The first one in the upper picture there is called The Map. This work is a mixture of a cello concerto with a video recording of various Chinese folk music practices, such as ritual dances, leaf blowing, and tongue singing, and various other vocal folk practices. And the other work in the lower picture there, it's called the Ghost Opera. It's a chamber music work for string quartet plus a Chinese folk instrument called the pipa. Now this string quartet would not only play their own instrument, but also make music with rocks, and paper, and water to sort of refer to the sound of nature. Right? And the pipa player there would not only play her own instrument, but also sing some excerpts from the model operas. And Tan Dun put all these very different musical elements together on stage. They sort of coexist and have high degree of authenticity, and the result is a hybrid of things. And I really cannot find a better word for that. And it's not just about, let's say, something Chinese versus something from the West, but also, let's say, the old symphony versus the new video, or the primitivism of the sound of nature versus the modernity, the civilization of the concert, right? And my work, which is highly analytical in nature, started with and follows the curiosity by asking the question, how much trace of his mature style can I find in one of his very early professional works? 8 Memories in Watercolor, the piece we're going to hear today, is a piano suite. It was composed in 1978, literally the first year he went to college for music. And the work was only published 9 years later in 1987, and that was the second year, by the way, he came to the States, right? And again, the work was published here in the States, and that was in 2004, so Shermer. And it was 1 or 2 years after his Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, I believe. The work has 8 short movements, each one with a evocative title. Now, the original Chinese version of the titles are they were slightly different from the current English ones, which could be described as culturally accommodating because the audience is different. But sometimes I find it can also be described as entrepreneurial. We'll talk one example of the title change later in the analysis. The first movement is called Missing Moon. The title is apparently a reference to the Mid-Autumn Festival in China. Now, this holiday is this kind of event for family gatherings. The families will get together, have a big hearty meal, and then enjoy the mooncake afterwards. In this particular work, we are going to hear the characters of two similar but different Chinese traditional instruments. The one in the upper picture there is called guzheng. Okay? It has 21 strings, a lot of strings, and have all these bridges underneath the strings. Okay? And it is a plucked scissor, and the instrument is sort of heard most often in court bands and ritual events. In other words, it's an ensemble instrument. It plays with other instruments, and it plays in time. Okay? And different from that, the other instrument is called the guqin in the lower picture there. It is also a plucked scissor. It has no bridges and only 7 strings, but it is kind of soloist, elite, that kind of instrument that is associated with the ruling class, the literati, and it is believed to have this kind of function to make your mind calmer, to make you wiser and make better decisions, right? And sort of as a way to demonstrate your privilege when you play that kind of instrument. Specifically, what we're going to hear in this work is the sound character of the guzheng. For example, the sweeping through the pentatonic kind of effect, or let's say the note bending effect that's created by pressing or pulling on the other side of the string. But at the same time, we're going to hear the spirit, the spiritual character of the guqin, okay? Which means the work is improvisatory. It is it has a lot of rubato and has this pretentiously slow tempo, okay? On top of those references, there's also this very Western modernist multi-mode play, I would call it, which means the music will shift through different pentatonic scales. Sometimes you have more than one going on at the same time. We're going to hear all these 5-1 gestures, so do, right, in the lower register especially, to sort of mark the structure of the work, because whenever we hear those gestures, we understand it's the end of phrase or end of section. So therefore, this work is a blend of something old and something new, right? And a lower kind of social class reference versus a higher one. And of course, the good old East versus the West. The second movement is called staccato beans. The work is this kind of fast, fun kind of music, and the main theme is almost a literal quotation from a local Hunan song. The work is pentatonic, but again with a lot of these 5-1 gestures, and it has this simple ternary form ABA, but in the middle section the music is going to modulate to a different pentatonic key, which is a very classic treatment of simple ternary form in the Western tradition, right? And in addition to that, we're going to hear all these leading tone kind of relationship, which doesn't exist in pentatonic scales, but more of, again, Western tonal kind of approach. And therefore, I will call this work a Western traditionalist, especially kind of presentation of Chinese folk materials. The third movement is called hard voice song. This work is in this style called shange, which means mountain songs. And these mountain songs are not only, let's say, heard in the mountainous areas, but for outdoor activities in general. For example, when people are farming or fishing or collecting firewoods, they will stop, take a break, and improvise, right? And sing songs to the nature, that kind of idea. And because of the geographic and linguistic variety of the country, the specific practice of these mountain songs are very different from region to region. But in general, they are improvisatory, which means they are free in terms of tempo or free or length of phrase, and they have this kind of male falsetto singing kind of character, so that sounds can be sent to faraway places. And also we have vocal bowls instead of text most of the time, and we have these long fermatas, which means stops at each long phrases, right? These long stops. This work in particular we're going to hear today is a love duet. Okay, it means two people singing to each other from a faraway distance. We'll have a parent, very high female voice that is accompanied and interacts with a male falsetto voice. But sometimes these two voices will do this very interesting parallel octaves, which, if you think about that, is impractical in the mountain sound style, because when two people are singing to each other from far away place, there's this delay of sound, and you just cannot do that. You just cannot sing together, right? My understanding of that is Tan Dun was probably thinking about the opera tradition in the West, because let's say in a Mozart opera, when two characters fall in love, they will sing in parallel octave. Okay, and in addition to that, we will hear this very idiosyncratic guzheng kind of playing the downward row of the chords, as well as the sweeping kind of effects through the pentatonic scale. And in addition to all this, we hear large passages of pianistic writing, such as long trills, a lot of pedal usage and arpeggios. That is a strong reference to the piano writing tradition. So therefore, this work, in summary, is a hybrid of Chinese folk, Chinese court music, as well as the Western opera and the piano music. The fourth movement, Brunam, is the nerdiest movement, in my opinion, of the set. It features this kind of invertible imitative counterpoint, as well as this idea of the formal play that blends this theme and variation and the simple ternary forms. Now, I try not to show too much score in this presentation, except for this work. We'll just look at the score real quick. So in the first line, we have this a very symmetrical, simple pentatonic melody that is homophonic and accompanied by a very simple piano left hand, making it sound like a theme, as if we're in theme and variation form. Now, from the second system, the second line, the same melody is played again, but this time with a imitative counter melody, therefore making it sound like a variation of the first line. From the third system, the same melody is now ornamented with the 16th rhythm, so it's quicker, but it's the same thing, right? And sort of at a higher energy level. And so far, we have a gradual increase of energy level kind of scheme, which is also a classic treatment of the theme and variation form. And eventually, when we get to the end of the second variation, when we expect the third variation to appear, we instead have this inversion of the first variation, which means the left and right hands change roles, right? So instead of hearing the third variation as a new variation, we sort of hear it as a structural return, as a return of previous materials. Therefore, in retrospective, we're going to hear this work probably as an introduction with an ABUA form. So this kind of formal approach, in my opinion, is a little bit elitist and kind of only entertains the very knowledgeable concert goers, the connoisseurs, right? So I would call it a westernized, elitist treatment of Chinese tune. The fifth movement is one we need to talk about the title. Now, it's called Red Whiteness. In the original Chinese version, the title did not have the word red, which apparently would remind at least some audience about the composer's connection to the communist world. Now, this work itself, it's in this French Impressionism kind of style. It's very abstract and spiritual, but there's nothing that could be described as being red. For example, revolution songs or model operas, right? There's nothing like that. My understanding is that probably by deliberately using this word red, Tan Dun sort of evoke that kind of idea, so some of the prepossessed audience can still hear what they wish to hear, that kind of idea. The main theme reminds me of the Chinese folk instrument called diz. It's this kind of, as you can see, woodwind, flute, that kind of instrument. And the theme sort of keeps coming back again and again, but it just hangs on there without being developed. In other words, it creates a time sense that is not goal-oriented, not climax building, as if, as we hear in, for example, in a Beethoven symphony, right? There's this protagonist to take on adventure and overcome difficulties and eventually heroically return. Instead, we have this very non-Western kind of aesthetics, or let's say philosophy, about music, it's not just about music, by the way, but also about life in general, because we didn't have that kind of, let's say, industrial revolution. So people were not so hyped about building and achieving, right, until, let's say, 20 years ago. Right before the reprise, we have this standing on 5 kind of moment that is also a very strong tonal reference. So, in summary, this work is a hybridization of post-tonal, the Impressionism, and the tonal techniques, as well as Chinese folk reference, and a very Eastern aesthetics. The 6th movement, Ancient Burial, in my opinion, is program music, which means it tells a story or depicts a scene. Now, my version of the story is like this. It feels like as if I hear this traditional Chinese funeral band from a faraway distance, okay? And they're gonna walk towards me as a listener gradually and passes me and eventually disappear at the end of the street corner. And the effect is achieved by, I must say, a witty design. The work is again in ABF form. In the A section, the music is quiet, and we have all these phrases that are fragmented, irregular, very chromatic, and sort of moves through different pentatonic keys. And therefore, it creates an image as if you hear this traditional Chinese funeral band from a faraway distance, and you cannot tell all the details of their playing, but there's one thing that you are certain is that they are not playing tune, okay? Which is very common in this kind of traditional funeral bands. In the middle section, however, the music becomes 40, the phrase becomes symmetrical. We have all this 2+2, 4+4 structure, and we have this clearly defined dual mode play, meaning 2 parts in 2 different pentatonic keys are doing this kind of call and response. So it creates a kind of image for me as if you hear this funeral band that is right in front of you, and you can hear all the details of their playing, but you are more certain this time they are not playing tune, right? The last section, the A prime, is just a copy and paste of the beginning section. And therefore, this work, I would call it, it's a blend of this high romanticism kind of idea of program music with a little bit avant-garde, a little bit the experimentalist approach of form, because it feels like a little bit cumulative form, that kind of idea, and you hear the fragments of the theme in the first place, but you don't hear the complete form of it until later in the piece. And of course, everything is set with this kind of Chinese folk backdrop. The 7th movement, Floating Clouds, is this kind of stunning depiction of the nature scene, the cloudy sky, and it has this kind of very cliche pentatonic melodies that are accompanied by arpeggiated, pedaled piano left hand, which is very pianistic writing. And the music would shift through different pentatonic scales very frequently with 2 hands unsynchronized. And therefore, by the way, I have one example for this. I mark these events with these red brackets here. For example, here, Tandun changes key on the right hand about half measure before the left hand. And again, in the next system, the key change is about 1 measure before the left hand. And by doing this, the originally a little bit cheesy kind of music turns into something you have freshness here and there, because the music feels out of tune here and there from time to time, right? And therefore, and in addition to that, we're gonna hear again all these 5/1 gestures that maps out the structure of the work in both lower and higher registers, making the work a blend of, let's say, pentatonicism, the experimentalist approach of key shifting, as well as the traditionalism of the tonal gestures of the 5/1s, and this unique reference to the nature scene, which is a topic that the composer is highly fond of in his mature style. And I would also argue this is highly associated with his childhood, because he probably really spent a lot of time playing in nature as a child. The finale, the 8th movement, Sun Ring, is this kind of fast, celebratory folk dance kind of music. It is arrangement based on a local Hunan nursery rhyme. And the title, according to current studies, may suggest the Water Sprinkler Festival of the Dai people, which is a ethnic minority in China. And this is during this Dai New Year festival, which happens usually in April. People would get on street and sprinkle water on each other on sunny days, of course, as a way to bless for good luck for the next year, and therefore sun ring, right? And in this work, we're going to hear this very interesting parallel fourth sonority, which is more of, I would say, a Western imagined version of Chinese music rather than a realistic one. And current studies have argued that Tandun was possibly inspired by this instrument in the picture head called Lu Sheng. As you can see, it's this kind of woodwind instrument. It has a main part and with several pipes plugged into the body, and each of these pipes has a finger hole on them, so therefore technically the player can play several notes at the same time. But based on my research, the typical way to play this instrument is that you play a melody, then you play chords to accompany that melody instead of, let's say, playing parallel fourths, which is imaginably much harder to do. And in addition to that theme, we have another theme in this work that is very dance-like, percussive, rhythmic kind of theme, and the two ideas will alternate with each other, and therefore again creates a more of a cyclic kind of time sense instead of a linear one. Now we have talked about all the musical hybridities in this work. How do we map this hybridity of musical elements onto the hybrid identity we started at the beginning? First of all, we apparently have this good old Eastern versus Western kind of conversation. Tandun, he was born in China in a world that was much less open compared to what we have today, but he sort of mastered this Western high art practice, and in his works, he sort of embraced both worlds of his cultural identities. Apparently, he's not someone who's like, I study Western avant-garde music, now I'm only gonna write serial music, for example. He embraces both worlds, right? And on top of that, we have this good and we have this old versus new kind of conversation, the traditionalism versus the modernism. He's apparently someone who likes old stuff, both from the West and the East side. But at the same time, we have all these references of contemporary music trends, for example, the multimode play, or let's say the key shifting unsynchronized between two hands, or let's say the cumulative form, right? And on top of that, we have these references of different social classes. Now, Tandun is apparently someone who comes from a lower social status, not necessarily grassroots, but definitely from working class. But he sort of made it to a part of the elite through winning, let's say, the college entrance exam in 1978. And by studying this first world high art practice as a third world person, considering he lived in a world that was much more separate in the 1970s, right? And in his works, apparently he embraced both his class identities. He does see himself as someone elite, but also he writes music that's he heard on the street, right? And on top of that, we have this apparent missing, I would say, of propaganda music, for example, revolution songs or modern operas, which I would argue that could be seen as political criticism kind of attitude, because if we think about that, propaganda music was actually a major part of his musical upbringing, and he hears those music growing up every day pretty much, but he sort of deliberately choose to reject that part and as a way to so I would say it's a political criticism kind of attitude, but at the same time, Tandun is apparently someone who's fond of his native culture, is fond of the musical practice of the minorities. So therefore, I would say there's still a sense of patriotism, although it might have a slightly different definition compared to what the Chinese government had in the 1970s, because they try to blend things together, right? You have to love the great leaders, you have to love the government, and you have to love the people. It's one whole thing. You cannot separate. But it might not be a fresh idea today, but for 1970s, someone lives in China, I would say it's a progressive and sort of mature kind of thinking. He was like, I like the people, I like the music of the people, right? But I don't care about the rest of the stuff. Now, why does this matter in the end? First of all, I think my analysis helps understand the composer and his art better. But also, if we think about the modern world today, hybrid identity, hybrid culture, hybrid music is more of a norm than something rare. For example, if we think about people living in this country, you're likely from immigrant family, or let's say you're doing a degree program at Peabody as international students, you're already dealing with some kind of hybrid identity, right? And eventually, the topics of hybrid identity, hybrid music, hybrid cultures matter to a lot of people, right? And I think it's kind of cool idea to have my final project to be part of this conversation. And I guess that pretty much sums my presentation today. Thank you all. I will do a little bit clear up for the stage, and I will play the work afterwards. Thank you.